service. And what I'm here to do this afternoon is to help get you ready for the soils portion of this year's Envirothon. And what we're going to talk about this afternoon is soils. And what soils is, it's a mixture of minerals, it's organic matter, gases, liquids, and it's a lot of micro and macroorganisms. Now, I thought I'd start out by talking about some facts about soil that you might not be familiar with. Whether you know it or not, it takes about 500 years to make 1 inch of soil. And if you take 5 tons of soil and spread it out over an acre, you'd have, it'd be as thin as 1 dime. And you've all seen a dime, and that's really not very thick at all. And if you take 1 gram of soil, which is a very small fraction of a teaspoon, it would contain 5,000 to 7,000 species of bacteria, which is quite a bit. And stop and think about 1 acre of soil, it could hold 5 to 10 tons of living beings. So if you stop and think about this bag of soil, this is dried out, there's nothing living in it whatsoever, but if you go out to your garden and dig up a spade full of soil, it's got a lot of living things in there. Some of it, if you took it apart during the summer, you're going to see some living organisms in it: earthworms, spiders, beetles, other bugs, other things you'd have to take a microscope to see. Now, when you look at soil, and we're going to take some time later on to look at these soil horizons, you can obviously see that there's a lot of different colors in these soils. If you look at this soil horizon, there's different textures, there's different shapes. And we're going to be talking about that during this soils presentation. And there's different components on these soil horizons. Soils are very different. And there's probably over 20,000 different types of soils. And when you stop and think about soils, plants and soils benefit each other. The soil provides an anchor for those plants to live in, and they supply the waters and the nutrients those plants need to live. And those roots of those plants, they penetrate that soil. And if we have compaction from tillage, they break up that compaction layer, and they allow that water to penetrate down through, and air goes through it. And it helps those organisms that I talked about a moment ago to thrive in that soil. So they interact together. And those roots, how many of you seen a stream after a storm? That water's brown. That soil that has run off. And those roots are going to help hold that soil and keep it from running off and getting into the streams and causing problems with our water quality. Now stop and think about this soil that I talked about for a moment. It's made of a lot of different things. And 45% of this soil, and I'm talking about a typical soil sample, it's comprised of minerals that you'll find, some of them on your periodic table of elements that you've learned about in your chemistry class. And those, that remaining 55%, 25% of that's water on a typical basis, unless you go to a Middle Eastern country like Iraq, where you're going to find a lot of sandy soils. 25% of it will be air, and 5% of it's going to be organic matter. And that can vary somewhat from soil to soil. There are exceptions to every rule, depending on how that soil is taken care of, whether you're talking forest soil, or you're talking a soil that's farmed a lot with conventional tillage. Keep in mind, soil should typically have a lot of microorganisms in it. And those microorganisms, particularly if you go into a forested area where you've got a lot of leaves in it, they're going to be in there, they're going to be breaking down those leaves into organic matter. And they're going to add to the organic content of a soil. another thing you need to think about is pH. You've learned about that in chemistry. Each soil has a pH. And it has an influence on the type of plants that can grow in that soil and the type of microorganisms that grow in that soil. If that soil is too acidic, certain microorganisms cannot grow in that soil, whereas other ones like a certain pH. Now let's talk a moment about soil texture. There's basically three types of soil and stuff here. And the soil is going to be determined as the proportions of the sand, silt, and clay that are present. And I'm going to have you come up here for a moment. I've got some soil samples that our soil scientist was gracious enough to give us. And we're going to talk about the clay. And you can consider it, typically it's the smallest soil particle, and it's typically considered this, like a golf ball. Your silt, it's like flour, and your largest soil particle is gritty. And what I want you to do is come up here for a moment. I've got some paper towels, and I want you to feel some of these different soil samples. And you may find this at your Envirothon test. They're going to ask you to touch some of these samples and determine what type of soil you're talking about.